Glad that you're here. I want to get your views at home about the presentation that we just heard from Professor Kringelbach on the parental brain and how we start to learn and teach empathy, especially in very stressful communities. So give me a call, 0891-104-207. We have experts that are up here with me and are keen to respond to some of those questions. I did mention before we went into the news that we bring in a few South African voices, and so let's start with the very first one, and that is Dr. Barak Morgan, who has joined us, and he of course is a neuroscientist. He's going to give us his own perspective. And in fact, before we started the show, I asked him what is it that he wanted to prepare, and he said, well, I want to ask a few questions, and I suppose he's going to be poking a few holes into Professor Kringelbach's presentation. Which is good, that's what South Africans do. We doy and we poke holes into things. But Dr. Barak Morgan is a biologist and a medical doctor with a clinical experience, mostly in psychiatry. Based in Cape Town, he works as a researcher in human, social, cognitive, affective neuroscience, and his varied background allows him to apply a wide range of interests, ideas, and techniques to complex brain, mind, and behavior questions. A lot of his research is in the field of early childhood development, focusing on the enduring impact of early social experience, especially poverty on brain structure and function in later life as well. A large element of his work involves translating neuroscience of ECD, so early childhood development, into the public domain in scientifically accurate ways. Please give him a warm round of applause.
And thank you, Morton, for such a wonderful presentation, which was so full of many interesting things. And yeah, perhaps how I was thinking of poking some holes in it, but you plugged those holes before I could get to them. And so I think it's still interesting to look at things from a South African perspective. And to do that, I want to refer to a paper that was published about 8 years ago in journal Nature by some behavioral scientists in the USA. And the title of that paper was Most People Are Not Weird. I think you probably know what I'm referring to, but I'll explain to the audience what they meant by weird. It stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich Democracies. And the point they were making is that the vast majority, probably something like 95% of behavioral and psychological research that is done in the world and appears in the textbooks and appears in our into popular culture is done on weird people, and who happen to be the minority of number of people in the world. And so they were making this point that there's a bias there, a cultural bias. And working in South Africa, which is largely a non-weird place, happy to say, proud to say, we have to be aware of these issues, we are aware of them. And to some extent, I think it's worth sounding a note of caution about thinking about parenting and whether it's paternal or maternal parenting, the kind of ways we think about it. And what's happened in the last I think 2 or 3 decades, probably starting before that, is an idea of parenting that's come out of the West that is often held up as the gold standard of how to parent, and of a kind of ideal, and there are many assumptions there from the researchers themselves that what they're talking about is of universal applicability. And that's been challenged, and perhaps I'll come to that just now, But what's relevant now coming out of your talk is that neuroscience has played such a big role in bringing the findings of psychologists to to spread it amongst academics and policymakers, but also to the attention of the general public. Psychologists pointed out things a long time ago, but no one took them seriously. Neuroscientists pointed it out, everyone said, "Ah, yes." So that's a bit, well, that happens to be the reality. And there's a danger of using certain frameworks of parenting to study parenting and to study what's going on in the brain during parenting, or the way that adults relate to children, and finding things in the brain, and then say, well, this is how it works everywhere. And there's good reason to believe that that's not the case. And one way of thinking about it, which came out of what you said, when you referred to and you showed those images of how harmonics organize matter, and it made me think that culture is a kind of a harmonic, and culture organizes the brain in exactly the same way. And when you came back to music at the end, I think you're saying the same thing. And there's good evidence that different cultures produce different ways of thinking, and that those different ways of thinking, not just thinking but feeling as well, are underpinned by different neural mechanisms. And this gave rise to the field of cultural neuroscience, which is really a very small field which needs to grow a lot. And you raised it yourself when you expressed a desire to do work in South Africa. So I guess I just say that I'm not so sure that it's going to be quite the same as it is in Denmark. And that's an interesting question to find out. And that's really what this whole weird, non-weird thing is about, is not to make assumptions about the way people think, the way they behave, and what's going on in their brains. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's Dr. Barack Morgan. He's staying with us, and when we come back from the break, we'll be joined as well by Professor Linda Richter. And I'll take your calls, 0891 104207. We'll start taking questions from the audience as well. You're still on the Talk Shop.
Every bit of news, be confident that SABC News will bring you all sides of the story straight from the source.
We were reminded that we are a service provider contractor, and our contract has come to an end.
It was indeed very painful to hear each and every 2 days that one patient has passed away.
You've denied responsibility for everything. Who would you say is responsible?
I don't know, Counsel. I don't know justice. Why don't you know? Because of what I presented to you, I don't know.
Stay tuned and informed and public. SABC News is #1 source of news.
Just got one more advert and another run live read. Science is our most important instrument for growth and sustainable development. We'll be igniting conversations about science, technology, and innovation at Science Forum South Africa. It takes place from the 7th to the 8th of December at the CSIR International Conference Center in Pretoria. The 2-day open science event includes science talks, short seminars, and opportunities for discussion and debate. Find out more at sfsa.co.za.
Some things come naturally to SAfm, like being SA's news and information leader. SAfm 104 to 107.
All right, you're still on the Talk Shop, and still at the Nelson Mandela Children's Hospital, bringing you the National Research Foundation's Science for Society lecture this evening. Professor Morton Kringelbach talking to us about the parental brain and new insights in brain imaging. We've heard our very own Dr. Morgan's response to that presentation, saying, yeah, it works in Denmark, not particularly work here in South Africa. But those are things we still have to test out, and I suppose this is where we start collaborations to really find answers to some of those questions. We have a rose joining the thorns as well. Professor Linda Richter is from the Department of Science and Technology's National Research Foundation's Center for Excellence in Human Development. If you ask me, I think one of the most underrated institutions we have in this country. And she's a leading expert in early childhood development. And she's with us now. Please give her a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much. There's so much to reply to in Morton's rich presentation and then Barrick's provocation. I have to kind of hem myself in and speak about a couple of points. I would like to acknowledge the National Research Foundation for establishing a Centre of Excellence in Human Development. We are, in fact, the only human and social sciences centre that is funded through the Department of Science and Technology and through the National Research Foundation. And I think it was visionary to think of the grand challenges of human development, of human behaviour, and the role it plays in our society. So in our centre, we study a wide range of things. Of course, development, human development, is almost a byword in South Africa. We talk about the National Development Plan. We talk about a developmental state, as if we understood what these words mean. We talk about human development in many, many contexts. So in the centre, we've sort of opened 4 windows on human development. The first is what we call life course development. Each of us develops as an individual from the moment we are conceived till when we die. We talk about intergenerational development. That's the development from one generation into the other, and we carry with us cultural, social capital, vestiges, genetics, everything along with us. We talk about socioeconomic development. That's the development of groups and individuals towards attaining the type of life they would like to lead. And increasingly now, we have a whole strand of research talking about transformational development. We're very interested in our own identities, and so this group talks about what people think of themselves, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be young, to be a child, to be gay, to be bisexual. And so all of these strands come together in the Centre of Excellence. And it works in a sort of hub and spoke model, meaning there's a small concentrated hub, and we network according to the mandate given to us by the National Research Foundation, universities throughout Southern Africa, through Africa and the world, in order to bring together excellence, as you saw tonight, so that we might capitalize by working together. But my own field of study is what Morton was talking about tonight, but from a different perspective. So while Morton was setting about, I think, Morton, given our age difference, you were probably at our school, I was beginning with the new technology of videos with the people at the very sort of precipice of new discoveries, looking at videotapes of mothers and babies playing with each other. And this new technology of videotape allowed us, as Morton described, to have a mom and a baby sitting opposite one another, a camera behind each of them, and fed into a mixer so that you could, as it were, stand in the middle and see what they were both doing with each other. And I spent many, many, many hours studying these videotapes. We broke them down into 2-second intervals, coding what mothers were doing, coding what babies were doing. And like everybody else in the world, we discovered there were unique harmonizations between mothers and babies in the way they moved. As a mother moved towards the baby slightly moved back. As the baby moved towards the mother, she slightly moved back. As she vocalized and said, "What are you thinking, my darling? Tell mommy." The baby would vocalize. The mother would find a space. If the baby coughed, the mother would find a space in the cough to say, "Oh, shit, you got a cough." And so there was this creation of this rich, non-verbal, pre-communication, universe between them that was built hugely on a kind of emotional relating to one another, a kind of wanting to be together. People often speak about when they have a baby, you fall in love with the baby. It is a love, you become obsessed and preoccupied. And grandparents look at their phones all the time, Beverly, and want to see another picture of the child. So there is a sort of obsession, emotional. We often talk about this stage as being what we call primary intersubjectivity. The parent, as Morton was emphasizing, this is not only mothers, although we've done many more studies of mothers than we have of fathers. But the parent and the child in this first phase that lasts for about 3 months or 3.5 months are really just communicating. We talk about the obligatory gaze of the baby. The baby looks at the face of the parent all the time. The parent is obsessed with the baby. So there's this intense love, creating what we call a phatic channel, a channel in which now other things can start to happen. And the thing that starts to happen is they begin to refer to things beyond themselves. So the mother says, "Oh, look at the light." The baby looks at light and they have some joint attention to that. It becomes a subject, and now their relationship is three-way. It's the person with the other person and with an object. And now you have the beginnings of, if you like, cognitions about the world, not just cognitions about another person. So that is what I was studying. And I did my postdoc in Edinburgh, where one of the pioneers of this work was, and I wanted to be in his lab and doing that work. But I came home and I set up a longitudinal study of African mothers working out of Kringelbach Hospital. And what I wanted to know was, do we see the same patterns of interaction? Are these basic elements of human development that we're seeing? Many people are beginning to talk about that these are the basic elements of language. That prior to the actual development of words and speech is this understanding that you have between the parent and the baby. And I set up a longitudinal study recording mothers and babies and observed this interaction across time amongst absolutely ordinary mothers who are coming to the hospital for routine health care. And Barak, I would say there are some differences, but these are fundamental atomic elements of human development. That what happens between parents and babies, the baby is hugely prepared for this relationship. Morton said babies just bring cuteness. No, they don't. They bring a lot more. Their brains are being prepared during pregnancy for a whole lot of sensory bombardment from the outside world that they will channel and receive preferentially everything to do with humans. So there's lots going on when a baby is born. There's lots of noise, there's lots of light, there's all, but the baby's brain is channeling information. They look for the human face. They're listening for the voice. They remember, they recognize their mother's voice from when she was talking during pregnancy. Within hours of being born, they recognize the smell of her breast milk. So the baby brings a huge amount, and as Morton was talking, every single one of us, brings an enormous capacity to parent. I think that's a huge takeaway for me from what Morton was talking about. This capacity to parent is something that has evolved in us over time. We have a rich history as mammals. We also draw a rich history as from marsupials, kangaroos, and other animals that rear their babies after birth in a very protected environment. And I always assert that humans are somewhere between this. We have a placenta, we feed our babies breast milk after birth, but we're also like marsupials, that the mother and the baby, or the parent and the baby, are somehow connected for several months after birth in a continuing process of brain and mind development. So I think there really are universal elements. It's like saying, is breast milk different from one part of the world to the other? Well, breast milk is fundamentally the same. There are differences depending on what you eat, what the breast milk will smell like, what it will taste like, and so on. But I think we have to sort out what are these universal, elemental characteristics of human interaction that Morton has been talking about.
I'm going to open up the floor to questions, but I think just as we start, and perhaps I might have missed this in the presentation, but I think this is a really important point to be covered, and I'll give it to you, Prof. Morton. What happens when that mother-to-child connection doesn't happen, right? What are we left with then? Because that's what we're looking at in a lot of communities, like the community in Kringelbach that you were looking at, where we're talking about levels of depression that are skyrocketing in the country. Parents, mothers who know absolutely nothing about postnatal depression and are not then connecting with our children, and our communities are in a mess. What is the trickle-down effect, if you can briefly respond to that, when that baby-to-mother connection just doesn't happen?
So we know from longitudinal studies, that if something goes wrong in that early period, they can have repercussions, maybe even 18 years later. So those kids are much more likely to be anxious and depressed later on. And yet, it's so little that needs to be helped. I mean, it's not something that they don't already have within them, but it's just that little bit of a push, that little bit of actually engaging in that doubt rather than ruminating about the world that is an awful place at the moment.
So we have a number of interventions that help mothers. I think it's wrong to say you have to teach mothers or parents how to do this. It is an endowed capacity. We all have a potential for it. Its expression is interrupted or disrupted. But many of the interventions to promote this bonding, this attachment, this interaction, come from helping the caregiver, the parent, see the baby's signals. So it's very simple counseling messages which say, do you see how your baby follows you as you walk around? You stand behind me and call your baby's name, and the baby head will turn. And when parents see these very small, seemingly insignificant responses from the baby, in which the baby demonstrates, it's you. I was conceived to be yours, and I've been with you for 9 months, and everything about you is something that I'm looking for and wanting. And once parents are helped to see that, it opens up this reservoir of capacity to be parenting. Now, I don't want to say it's just easy and simple. It's not easy and simple, because even depressed mothers who relate better to their babies don't necessarily become less depressed. You also have to do some other things for the mother's depression.
Right. I'm going to stand up so I can start taking questions from the audience. Maybe not. If you do have a question, I'll bring the microphone over to you. I do think as I walk over, perhaps Dr. Barak, I think you should take this one as briefly as possible. You talked, Prof, about men not liking babies. And I think that needs to be looked at, because in the South African context we have fatherlessness that is also out of control. And is there a way that we can turn that around? And is that just about the money in the pocket? How do we start saying, if we can treat mothers with postnatal depression, can we do the same with fathers that are struggling to connect with their children?
Well, I think it's about unlocking that reservoir. It's about giving men the space to also actually show that we like babies. Even in Denmark and in the UK, it's not okay for us to show that we actually like babies. But yet, for us as well, it's a source of joy. I remember, again, speaking from experience, I had breast envy. This idea that I could only do the nappy changes rather than the actual feeding. It was a difficult thing, and it may not be part of at least some South African cultures. But I think there are work to be done here, and I think important work to allow men that space.
Please introduce yourself as well.
It's Tony Pelby again. I have a question with regards to what research has been done looking at attachments longitudinally as well. Say, if you had a poor attachment to your mother, what is your attachment then like to your baby? Obviously, the attachment issues that will come in the first generation are things that have been linked to, say, addiction, where the opioid receptor has been linked to a bad attachment style. And then, so again, it's the nature and nurture debate. So our love for babies is heavily constrained, obviously, within all kinds of cultures. And men, the way men like babies, I think even attractiveness for adult women, attractive features in an adult woman, the more attractive the adult female seems, her features are more infantile in a lot of ways. That's why, say in Japan, I think they've even got a word for that cutie attractiveness. So I think there is then where men can relate more to liking babies as in, say, females who look younger. But with regards to the nature-nurture game, so if there is an element that is constrained, how much of your attachment to your child is related to how your mother attached to you?
Thanks, Tanya. I wouldn't cast it in the nature-nurture sort of frame, because I think what I often call the new science of early childhood development is showing us is that nature and nurture are mutually influencing each other. I mean, if we think of epigenetics, for example, the way the environment is actually instructing genes on how they are expressing themselves. So, we used to think, well, that's genetic. You just get a sort of set of genes and that's how they play themselves out. We know that is not true now. We know that the environment tells the genes, you better do this and you better do that, because that's going to be a better fit for survival. So I don't think it's that. But what we do have is long-term studies of attachment into adulthood. So we look at the quality of the parent or the mother-baby relationship in childhood, and then have followed those people up to when they have children as adults. And funnily enough, the attachment, which Morton pointed out, is really based on two characteristics: sensitivity and responsivity. The parent recognizes that the baby is trying to communicate and responds. So these two characteristics are what build the attachment, this very affectionate relationship, and build the security and stability of this relationship. In adulthood, what do we see? We see people who might actually have, in some senses, rationally overcome their own attachment. But if we ask them about their relationships with their parents, they have a disorganized schema of what they think their family life was, or their relationship with their mother was. Meaning, here these interactions of an emotional kind with a baby before they can speak, prior to 9 months of age, are then expressing themselves 40 years later in the way you think about your childhood, and therefore it becomes the organizing schema of how you think about relationships. So yes, they do carry forward intergenerationally, but people also can escape these things. There are many kind of transitional experiences in life. People often talk about particular experiences that changed the course of their emotional life completely. They fell in love with somebody. They had huge admiration for a teacher who really fundamentally changed the way they think. So I don't think they are determining in some kind of very square-edged way, but they definitely influence your patterning of your thinking, the schema of your thinking about relationships.
Any questions from the audience? I'll take calls on 0891 104 207. Again, 0891 104 207. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Mercy Manyema from Wits University, and I have two quick questions. The first one is that I wonder, have you done any research on people that rape children or people that abuse babies? Not necessarily because you're talking about babies. And then the second question is, does this sort of cuteness of babies have anything to do with broodiness? You know, the broodiness of women when almost suddenly, I guess, they just want more babies.
Well, maybe let's start with the broodiness. Men get it too. Some of us get quite excited about babies at a certain age, or the women that can have those babies, of course, as well. So it goes together. So almost certainly, I think cuteness is almost like a Trojan horse. I didn't explain it that way, but I think it is. I think one of the reasons why we accepted a lot of Syrian refugees into Europe was because we saw that little kid on that beach, and we allowed ourselves to make the othering become in-group, out-group become in-group. And I think that's what cuteness does. It shows us a capacity for love. And so, yes, I think moodiness could be it. There are no scientific studies that I know of. Some of my colleagues may be able to tell me more, but as opposed to the dark side of love, because that's really what we talk about. Why would you do something like that to something that innocent? Why would you be a paedophile in the first place? Why is it that people that abuse are usually having been abused themselves? Why are you perpetrating? Why are you continuing that pattern? I haven't personally done any studies on this. There are very few studies out there on pedophilia, but of course it's something that is rampant. I've come to learn that it is one of the things that is also quite a scourge in this society as well. Not just from adults, but also from other kids of older age. Why would you do that? It's love gone wrong, certainly. It's certainly some kind of gratification. Certainly nothing to do with flourishing or anything that is positive. So the short answer is, I don't know what's going on in these brains, but I would love to know how we could stop that. And yet, of course, it's something that happens not just within humans, but also in other animals. How do we stop aggression? I mean, if cuteness can't stop it, what can stop it?
Take the next question.
So, Safo Besharati again. So I had a question for Morton from his talk, if that's okay. Thank you for your talk. Thank you for all the commentary. So, if I remember correctly, you talked about the orbital frontal cortex as being the pleasure center of the brain, right? So that's in the front of the brain, and it's very important for emotion. And for me, emotion is very raw. It's very instinctual. So actually, I think of the subcortical areas. So those are the middle part of the brain. And then the more ancient areas, you find them in animals as well. And not to say the orbital frontal cortex isn't important, but I wonder why maybe the data shows it, but isn't there more of a network?
Can I just step in there and just ask that you respond to that question after I've taken the caller, because she's been on the line for a while. Nelly is on the line from Hartbees. Nelly, good evening. Welcome to the NREF Science for Society lecture.
Thank you.
Yes, Nelly, what is your question?
My question is from Dr. Naledi's comment on weird and unweird people. And what's the confusion then on how the brain changes for a parent? Would it be different in first world countries to third world countries? And if I can still have further, would it be children that mothers smoke would be different in the first world countries versus the third world countries?
Okay, that's a really good question, Nelly. Thank you so much for calling. I'll take more calls 09110427. This is essentially the issue that you had raised, Dr. Morgan. Like the issue of the weird versus the non-weird brain. That sounds terrible. But essentially that's what she said. So the context of a first world country versus second world country, and you talked about that difference. Then we'll let the Prof respond to Sab's question. And please just take that a step further. So what exactly it was that you were referring to, and some of the differences that you might have seen in the way that children respond to their parents in different settings.
Sure. So I think the point that was made earlier by Barack was a wonderful one, namely how much culture means to us and how it shapes our brains, essentially, how it shapes the landscape of the brains and, of course, the way that we react. It's certainly true for a lot of things that are cultural, like music. I mean, music is a great example of something that is almost entirely culturally determined. The question, of course, is one where, my two colleagues here disagree. To what extent are biologically very strong behaviors like parenting something that can be shaped and is shaped by culture? There are clearly things that are shaped by culture, but what about those instinctual kind of things that happens between the father and the mother and the baby, the kind of intimate dance that we showed? The data from Linda and from others that have looked at it in this country and other so-called third world countries, but low and middle income countries we like to call them these days, is that there doesn't seem to be much of a difference. I'm not sure that that is the absolute answer to that question. I'm sure Barack has some data that would sort of speak against it. But I think at the same time it will kind of make sense, certainly when it comes to pleasures. There are no differences between high and low pleasures. The kind of pleasures you get from music are no different from the ones you get from chocolate. So there's a circuit there that we share across cultures. that basically is one that can change, of course, when we get depressed, and it can be changed and it be set in childhood, but it's the same one anywhere we are. And so, of course, once you then start to play with that circuitry, you will basically, essentially look at the same kind of responses. So, did you want to maybe
add to that? I think you should.
Okay, yeah. Unfortunately, it's a bit complicated, but I'll try and keep it simple. Linda's absolutely correct when she talks about nature and nurture working together. And so just on that point, up until about 10, 15 years ago, that nature-nurture debate was largely dominated by hot air, and about that 90% hot air and about 10% science. And there have been tremendous advances in epigenetics recently, which have turned those numbers right around. And now we understand a lot about how the environment influences the genes, and the genes in turn impact on the environment. Now, to give one example, in a study that was done in Kringelbach in about 2000, and it's exactly the same study that Morton referred to with Alan Stein, a parenting program was implemented with pregnant mothers. And the aim of the program was to enhance maternal sensitivity and responsiveness. And the main outcome measure was security of attachment, which is an important concept, as we mentioned a few times. And the results were absolutely the intervention increased levels of secure attachment. And that was published in 2009 in the British Medical Journal, and it was an important study. 12 years later, okay, I was not involved in that original study. 12 years later, Mark Tomlinson, who led that study, professor of psychology at Stellenbosch University, got funding to follow up those same kids. And I joined him on that study. One of the things I did is I collected DNA. And I determined the genotype of every child in the study for a particular gene. And what turned out is that the whole effect that was found only applied to children with a certain form of the gene. The other kids, who made up 60% of the sample, whether they got the intervention or not, made absolutely no difference. So what you see there is that the genes were strong. The environment made no difference whether they got this home visiting program. For the other kids who had the short form of the gene, it made all the difference. Those who received the intervention were much more likely to be securely attached, and those who didn't receive it were much less likely. And they were much less likely to be securely attached than the ones with the long genes, irrespective of whether they got the intervention or not. The short gene, not getting the intervention, was very bad for them. So this whole nature-nurture thing is quite complex, and that's one point. Now, just to come back on the other point about weird and non-weird, there is evidence, good evidence that we collected fastidiously over the last 40, 50 years by anthropological psychologists looking at other societies in Africa and elsewhere. Now, this idea of good parenting, or that good relationship being warmth, sensitivity, responsiveness, one-to-one, face-to-face, your turn, my turn, that Linda described, does not happen in a whole, large number of cultures. In those cultures, or in many cultures, warmth is not paramount. I think in Western culture, warmth only became recently a valued element of the way parents relate to children. Certain societies, strictness and much less warmth was very much part of the way. In East African societies, the mother and the infant do not face one another. The infant tends to be in front of the mother, both of them looking in the same direction towards others. And the interaction is not infant-led, parents lead the interaction. And this your turn, my turn thing doesn't happen. And they also, many, the Africans say it takes a village to raise a child. It's not a dyadic unit or atomic unit. It's polyadic. And there are a whole lot of things which are different or going quite the opposite direction to this model or idealized version of parenting that is very much in the textbooks. So I want to explain that.
So
Naledi?
Yeah, I just if you can respond as briefly as possible, because we've got a few callers on the line. But I saw a few interesting responses.
Bring your callers in.
All right, let's bring them in, and then we'll take it further. Let's see, Anela from Port St. John's. Anela, good evening.
Yes, good evening, Assistant. Good evening to the panel. I've got a two-pronged question along the lines of culture. I would like to ask. As African males, we tend to have certain things culturally that are still frowned upon and seem sort of unacceptable, such as changing the baby's nappies as a father, or waking up in the middle of the night to assist a crying baby, or feeding the baby. Does that mean in the long run that would affect possibly the father-to-child relationship as the child grows up, because the father gave less attention to the young baby? Secondly, I'd also ask to know whether mothers that give birth to triplets or quadruplets, surely it must be pretty difficult to balance the level of attention that they give to the babies. Does that also mean that the babies that receive less attention from the mother in the case of triplets or quadruplets, could that possibly affect the relationship between mother to child as the child grows up? Thank you.
Okay, those are fabulous questions, Anela. Thanks for calling. Jay is in Durban. Jay, good evening.
Good evening to you and good evening to your panel. My question is quite a number of questions. In regard to just recently I heard in the show that mothers who are going on maternity leave, they also must have the same rights and privileges. My very concerning question is, especially about schoolgirls who have babies, they want to think about that baby's father is a schoolgirl, which means he has to also take 6 months off from school. Right, that is one part of it. Preparing the mother for the baby, the bonding should be both the parents. Now what happens if she's a schoolgirl? How does the bonding take place? Because I come up from a culture where we are taught to have both the parents there, prepare our lives long ahead before we complete what is expected of us in our house, in our lifestyle, and what is expected from both the parents before and after the baby comes.
Thank you.
It is such a communal thing among us. We share everything in bringing up the baby. So our eating habits, our environment, all this is taken an account too.
Yes. Thank you so much for calling, Jay. I need to just wrap it up because I don't have much time, Jay, but I really appreciate that input, and I think that you've actually asked some really pertinent questions. Think of the levels of teenage pregnancy in this country. I have about 4 minutes left of the show. Can you believe it? So I'm going to give you a minute each to wrap up when we come back from this really short break.
What's up, real talkers? So, you've seen our studio and had some changes, and now we can accommodate you. Come join us here on Real Talk. Email us realtalk@cheekymedia.co.za, and you can share in on a live studio experience and make this stage yours too. Get the all-new and improved season of Real Talk with myself, Ane, Mondays to Friday, 5 to 6 p.m. on SABC.
We barely made it out alive last night. This time around, we could swear he was going to kill us. He kept kicking us and shouting. I can still remember his bloody hands beating us. But luckily, we managed to get out of there.
A blow to them. It's a blow to all of us. This is the news of activism. Make women stand up with their program and take a stand. Report appeal to the Gender Commission on 0800-708-7709. This initiative is supported by the SABC Foundation.
Your topic could make it onto the talk show. Just email talk@safm.co.za or tweet @SAFM Radio.
And we're wrapping up the final minutes of the NRF Science for Society lecture on the parental brain, new insights from brain imaging. Let's get closing thoughts from Professor Linda Richter.
Thank you very much. The question of whether parents differ across cultures, whether their brains differ across cultures, their behavior differs across cultures, is a very contentious matter and hotly debated. But let me paint a picture to you of two mothers. One is living in Parkview, she's married, they are financially secure, she's at home with her tiny baby, and she is taking care of her baby. On the other side of town in Soweto is a working class woman who has a job in the middle of Johannesburg. She doesn't sleep well because there's a lot of noise going on. She gets into this incredibly noisy train. There's constant harassment. She maybe is struggling to put food on the table, and she goes home to her baby. There is no doubt in my mind that those two brains are different. Now, are they different because of culture, or are they different because of the kinds of stresses and interference happening in those brains, which is affecting how they can relate to their babies? In order for parents, I think it has also evolved in human society that for mothers to take care of a young child requires a certain degree of protection, which is expressed in many cultures, of isolating the mother with her baby and looking after her and her baby to allow the attachment to the breast, the interaction between them, to take place in a relaxed and protected environment. We are putting parents under incredible stresses, more so in poor countries than in rich countries.
Thank you. A round of applause, please, for
Well, I'd just like to echo that the scenario that we described is incredibly pertinent and important. It's not only about relationships between parents and children, but we also have to think about the relationships between society and parents and the impact that has on parenting. And in order to understand what's going on, we need to really look at the big picture and take those things into account. Social justice, social inequity.
Absolutely, and this is why when we have these engagements, we wish the Department of Science of Social Development were here as well. We're able to be more impactful. A round of applause, please, for Dr.
I just want to say that I'm really happy that I came here today. I think it's extremely nice to have all these different perspectives. I think, of course, there are things we disagree about, things that we are still looking at, things we're still trying to understand. But that's part of being curious, it's part of being human. And one of the things I'd like to take home from here today is this ability that babies across cultures, across oceans of differences, have this ability to basically bring out the best in us, to really see what is the nature of love. And however it is that we engage with them, probably in all my work and pleasure, the most important pleasure we have is that of other people, whether it be babies or whether it be humans, other humans, adults, That, I think, shows us the nature of love. And that, I think, is probably the most noble thing we can do. Understand how it is that we can so we can help those who have not.
It's a brilliant way to close it. Now I have nothing to say. Thank you. A round of applause, please. I think it's truly been such a fruitful discussion, and I hope that as each of your projects go forward, that you keep us updated at the talk shop as well, because I know that I'm interested, and I'm sure that my listeners are too, to keep looking at the work that is being done in human development. Keep it up and keep us informed. There's nothing worse than knowledge being generated and it's not being shared with anyone. Thank you so much to the National Research Foundation for having us back again for this Science for Society lecture series. Dr. Beverly Demons and the rest of your team, always absolutely brilliant. The Brain Matters team, you guys have done a phenomenal job. And I'm glad we got the final one. That means bigger and better, right? We're the winners. To the rest of the attendees, thank you so much. A round of applause for yourselves. And thank you so much to the listeners, the SAFM team, Lesego Mahonyane, Tulufalo Belo, and our technical team, Phineas, Stanley, and Andrew. Gariso, he's going to kill me. Gariso, excuse. That's how we wrap up the show. Nancy Richard takes over now with the Enviro Show.